Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We are now beginning the afternoon session of the 8th China Global Think Tank Innovation Forum. Our next roundtable is the China-West Dialogue Roundtable number 1, which is reframing U.S.-China bipolar dynamics by pluralizing into China-West relations. To chair this roundtable, let's warmly welcome Colin Bradford, non-resident senior fellow of the Global Economy and Development Program, the Brookings Institution, and he's also co-lead the China-West Dialogue. And we also warmly welcome Dr. Wang Huiyao, president of CCG and former counselor to the State Council. Let's warmly welcome them.
下面有请分论坛的联席主持人，布鲁金斯学会全球经济与发展项目高级研究员、中西对话发起人科林·布莱特福德先生。 和全球化智库理事长、国务院原参事王辉耀先生，大家掌声欢迎。
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be in a somewhat smaller roundtable where we can hopefully have a good discussion. So I would encourage, as Henry did this morning, for people to be brief, but enter often briefly rather than enter only once at length. Let me just give you some background about what we're trying to do in this session, which is listen, precisely. Is that on July 28th, it just happened that Henry Wang and Mabel Miao were in Boston for family reasons. And I live in Boston now, and Eric Balsbow, who couldn't make it to this meeting, is a Bostonian. And Susan Thornton, who's a 30-year experienced diplomat in the State Department, who's a big player in our China-West dialogue, and was also there, and Jorge Heine, who is the former, some of you will know from China, the former Chilean ambassador to China here, who's written an excellent book in Spanish for Latin America about China. He was there as well as Alan Alexandrov flew in from Toronto, who's co-chair of the China-West Dialogue. So 7 of us met from 9 in the morning. We had dinner together the Thursday night, the 27th, and then met all day from 9 to 5 and with lunch served in the room. And we developed this outline that you've, an earlier version of the outline that you've seen, and later Susan Thornton wrote the one-page summary of the outline to sort of anticipate what the main messages might be. And Susan wisely understood that in the end, if you're trying to do a vision statement, which is the idea here, that embodies lots of views, it's likely to be lengthy and that it needs to be boiled down into a one-page summary of what are you really trying to say? So those are documents you have in front of you. I hope you've had a chance to look at them before this. Because what we would like to do is we did a similar session to this on Saturday morning with Matt Furchin there as well, who's part of our group now. He's at the Yale Law School Center for China and has been teaching for 10 years at Tsinghua University. So Matt is a welcome member of the China-West Dialogue and someone who is well prepared to be part of it. So in any case, we were in Shanghai for a conference on Friday and met for an hour and a half with the 5 people from the Shanghai Institutes of International Studies and one other think tank in the Center for CIIS, Dr. Wang, who was just here this morning, and did a similar thing. We did a listening session. Okay, what do you think a vision statement that would be forged by a variety of Americans, Chinese, Europeans, Canadians, Japanese, Chileans, and et cetera, what should be in it? What are the big ideas? And I think as many speakers said this morning, the urgency of the continuing dominance of the geopolitical tensions between the United States and China overwhelming the global governance system so that our progress in generating cooperation and coordination on facing the many global challenges that we're all aware we are facing is continuing at a rapid pace. And even though there's been a new initiative which everyone welcomes of an opening again of official channels of dialogue between the U.S. government and the Chinese government at cabinet level, that is still insufficient, that we need to accelerate our own ideas about how this could be broken open, how there could be an alternative path forward. And I outlined briefly this morning, and not as articulately as I sometimes do, is what the pluralism idea looks like. Why pluralism seems to be a very strong dynamic when you have strategic autonomy in Europe and non-alignment in Latin America being, and the Japanese themselves considering an alternative path to its own strategic vision of its role in Asia. You really realize the degree to which almost every country in the world wants to define its own position in the world and its own policy in the world and have its own policy space. And so I think the pluralism, I think Joe Nye was absolutely right, Henry, when he said that, if he's still here, he's not, said that multipolarity has a certain danger of being, I think, a static concept, because it describes the structure of power. It doesn't necessarily describe, well, I think the word pluralism, to pluralize the U.S.-China relationship into a China-West relations when West is a non-geographic term and really implies middle powers coming into the conversation and professionalizing it, rests on this idea of shifting coalitions of consensus rather than blocks. So it's a powerful force that's rooted in cultural differentiation, which is an underappreciated propellant of economic development that economists have woefully neglected, is that that pluralism is really a much more behavioral and dynamic and organic concept than multipolarity. So in any case, what we'd like to do is just to open the floor to your inputs into what you think are the most important elements that need to be articulated by a diverse group of thought leaders that come from think tanks around the world that could usefully specify not only visions of how alternative dynamics could be put in play that would change the current dynamics, but also get specific about where the really potential areas of cooperation and progress could be made in an eclectic, pluralistic group like the G20 or the kind of group we've put together in the China-West dialogue, and the kind of dialogues you might well decide to put together yourselves to pluralize the conversation in whatever professional realms you're working in where you're having trouble reaching agreement. So I'd just like, Henry, if you'd like to say a few words, because you and I see things very similar, in fact, on all of this, and I'd welcome your input before we open it up.
Okay. Thank you, Colin, for the introduction. Yes, I think this China-West dialogue has been, as Colin mentioned, has been existed for the last 3 or 4 years actually, and you had over 30 Zooms and meetings, and I probably participate half of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
And I found that was very interesting. It was even though there's so many things that's been happening between China and the U.S., China and the West, yet there's no framework of talking of how the two can really coexist or collaborate. And so China-West dialogue, and many times the U.S. was referred to was, how we can find the common space, like we mentioned here, kind of two superpowers with the global ambition create space for communication. Right. And also what concretely the rise of a pluralism, as you said, that multipolar world, and how we can really have a system to support that. And of course the global order now is suddenly we all recognize that since the Bretton Woods system and after Second World War 78 years ago, we need to enhance, improve, enlarge, and how can we really upgrade that? That's a thing. And so what are the global political dynamic of this situation? I think we had a very good conversation offline, first time for the China-West dialogue in Berlin this month, in April this year, which we had 6 members of CCG delegation was there, and
right.
Professor Wang was also part of that, Victor Gao and myself and many others. And of course, we have, again, we met in Boston to further elaborate that. So I think it's great that we also been hearing this morning saying, okay, think tank talk too much, but maybe should hear also, but more important, should come up with the ideas and framework and kind of a track to approach. So if we, as the think tank represented by the Chinese think tank, US think tank, European think tanks, other international think tanks, can reach some consensus, then we can probably, easy to tell our policymakers, here are the, consensus we have been building, and let's really change the narrative somehow into a more pragmatic way of doing that. So that's exactly, I think, the purpose of the roundtable that you and I have been really asking to hold. So I would really think that let's think about those frameworks, how the things we can work together, and how the things we can, phrase and stand and accommodate and come up with some consensus. So that's exactly this roundtable. We're going to have a whole afternoon devoted to that, and would like to hear our think tank colleagues' great ideas and suggestion for that. Thank you.
Thank you. So the floor is open. We'd like to hear from you. So that you can either key off the outline and the summaries, or you can weigh in on something that you think is important that may not be there yet. I did neglect to say, since there's a small pause, so that we also are planning at the end of November to have a couple of small meetings of 6 or 8 people in Washington after this, very similar to the Shanghai meetings and this meeting, to collect ideas and to get people to contribute to this whole conversation.
Who wants to start? Zhu Feng, 你说. Yeah. Can you start? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Huiyao, and thanks, Dr. Bradford's, I think, very illuminating opening remarks. I think the time has been just running tougher, ever tougher, more than most of the time since the end of Second World War. The reason is multiple. First of all, then we will see the global issue is hitting the Earth harder. The other is then we'll see the power redistribution structure. Today, yes, no matter how the pluralism is attractive, but the real power structure is remain unipolar moment. So my friends, Professor John I. Camberry once made a great point. He said he concluded the unipolar moment maybe based distribution of a power formality in the history. The reason is American by nature is benign power, benign hegemon. But it seems to me now his theory is also just again going empty. I think a couple of the domestic reasons, of course.
Empty.
Yeah. I think a couple of the domestic reasons is also just running very dramatically high. For example, what's the Americans' domestic politics? I'm a dean of the School of International Studies of Nanjing University. I'm also specialized in American studies. So today's American domestic politics is really get all American observers very, very stranger and also very curious what is happening in your country. Since President Lincoln declared liberation of the black slavery, since then I see the U.S. has never been more divided and tumbling into the domestic, some sort of, we say, such a fragmentation and even frictions. But the problem is foreign relations and domestic politics. They are always indispensable, some sort of very indigenous combination. So it makes a lot of sense to me. As long as U.S. feel vulnerable domestically, the U.S. Cross-spectrum consensus is running high. a lot of American elites and policymakers and even political figures prefer to play up the China threat as high as possible, then make a great use of some sort of a China's posed, international threat to the U.S. Therefore, then China's threat become some sort of facilitator for the Americans' domestic politics to re-achieve the cohesion and even unity. So in that sense, I really feel very, very disillusioned about the China-U.S. relations. Because as long as some sort of such a political peculiarity of the United States will not just persistently and remarkably change anymore, then I see there's no room for our relations to just get improved. So that's why when we think about the pluralism, will be booming in future, to be honest, there's no way at all. I read the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal every day. I see some sort of such a very dramatic domestic political tone in the U.S. never changed. Whatever China is to become some sort of increasingly debatable, but the problem is U.S. now is decided to make use of China factor. So then against this backdrop, I see, yes, no matter how we just make the effort to pulling the relations closer or make some sort of compromising gesture, how our bilateral relations could finally and eventually skip over the domestic barriers in the United States. So as a professor, I have to say, as long as Americans' domestic politics remain highly fragmented and highly fractured, then there's little hope that both governments could truly just give each a warm embrace. But the problem is, faced with this some sort of, we say, terrible reality, is there any way we can work on together? Yes. Any way that we can work together. Yeah. I see people-to-people relations. It's always some sort of big, the cushion to any escalating, we say, escalation, because if we just have a very quick and even just a brief look at our history, back to the 30s, last century, what's China? China is some sort of small, weak girl who just deserve a lot of sympathy from Americans. But after Japan's invaded China, China also become the most robust alliance to the U.S. Now I'm a worker from Nanjing University. Most reliable alliance during the Pacific War. Yeah. So then, now I'm working from Nanjing University. Nanjing is a real historical witness to how rich, how robust our historical connection once used to be. So then, people-to-people relations should go in beyond some sort of a political, arguments and political fragmentation, and keep both peoples sticking together, because we needed to know more about each other. So today, China is really re-emerging, but China largely is a transitional power. Of course, sooner or later, China also will be a shining democracy. There's no question for that. But how all American friends could still bear your confidence over China's future? So then today, I think after Joe Biden came to the power, he's just a very, it seemed to me, as a very badly declared, the real, the competition between, today's world is just between U.S.-centered democracy and China and Russia-centered authoritarian. That kind of, I think, a very vicious dichotomy should be totally tossed aside. Yeah, otherwise, we couldn't really have a very serious look at each other. On the other hand, secondly, I want to suggest neither of us sides should be smarty pants. I'm serious. Yeah, Chinese and Americans, we are all very, very proud of our culture, civilization. That's the point I think President Biden made very correctly. He said now the competition, the confrontation between Beijing and Washington is competition between the two civilizations. But what civilization definitely means for policymaker and thinker? They consider we are more morally better positioned than you to ask you to do this, ask you to do that. If we always just move that way, China and the US, Chinese and Americans will be very quickly just become smarty pants. What does the smarty pants mean? Yeah, I mean, I always consider I'm a great, you are wrong. So we should really, really eliminate some sort of, as I mentioned, such a vicious dichotomy, then creating some sort of a more space, not just practically, but also spiritually, yeah, to keep both sides accommodate with each other. Last point I want to say is this. Why U.S. remain very, very stable and robust in your unipolar position? Because your network proved to be much robust than China. So China, that's also the one point. China also wants to learn from the U.S. Yes, today China just believe, we did a lot of things. We are biggest contributor to the world economic growth. We are also become the first donator of our, COVID, some sort of such a medicines and the COVID, such a rescue bills to the third world countries. But there's no way China always just feel proud of how good we are. Most important is how broad and profoundly just spread it out. China's network. So from this point, future China's re-emergency has no way to skip the U.S., has no way to take a detour from our relations with Washington. So then, but from my views to the U.S. is also this. If the U.S. could just feel, today, even just the unipolar moment remain just, unshakable, but how to pull in China into some sort of U.S.-centered, such a new global networking. It's also another challenge. So conclusively, yes, today's world situation is running very tougher and very harsher, but the problem is I think the US and China should still feel great compelled to stick each other.
Do what? What was the last thing?
Sticking with each other, yeah. Let me stop here.
Yes, please. Thank you. So that was a very interesting, telegraphically, I don't want to get hung here because I want to go around the room, but I just wanted to telegraphically say that one of the things we've realized in the China-West dialogue from the beginning was that there was a huge connection between the social order divides that you described and the global order frictions. And so what I've come to say just recently is that the way I would describe what you described, which I agree with, is that the way China, and by the way, I regret to say this, but you know it perfectly well, is that China too has the same problem internally that, some of the unemployment rate in the younger college better educated group is a concern. And, I feel for you because we have the same, if you think of different quintiles of the income distribution, the problem isn't that the revolt is at the bottom, in the bottom quintile. The problem is that there's a concentration in the top two, but the political revolt is coming from the middle two quintiles, the 20 to 60 of the population. The middle class that thinks their lives should be getting better when they're not. And you suffer from the same problem. So, and it seems to me that, curiously enough, that as I understand it, the theme in OPEC is precisely to address this issue of inclusion. And unfortunately, I'll have to say to you as an economist, an American economist, but unfortunately American economics has become international economics, is that macroeconomics is concerned primarily with price stability, that is fighting inflation, financial stability, that is financial markets not being chaotic, and a strong exchange rate, or a stable exchange rate. So modern economics has been very financialist in its orientation, and never, even as a development economist, has, in my professional experience, has there been enough focus on the social impact of macroeconomic policy. It's not even a metric by which you trace it. Yes, the employment rate is tied to GDP growth, but there's not a kind of social democratic approach in which there are metrics of social inclusion and support, which are part of how you measure the results of your economic policy. It's just, economics has failed as a vision that includes inclusion, includes social impact. And so both of us are floundering in how to deal with this middle class revolt, where people have expectations of rising prosperity but aren't getting it. So we end up talking to each other officially back to back. And we talk to each other back to back precisely for the reason you said, is that when our diplomats finish talking with each other, they hold press conferences and don't talk about really how they related to each other, but talk to the domestic audience about how they think the domestic audience would like to characterize what has been going on. And it does reflect exactly what you say. So I think the reason I'm going on at some length here, which I regret in terms of the rest of you, is that we've already anticipated this, and the question is, can one of the things that we put in a vision statement is there needs to be increasing a focus, first of all, on the social divides as underpinnings for a more cooperative and multilateralist policy, number one. And number two, is it unreasonable to ask our diplomats, which I think it's not unreasonable to ask our diplomats, to be more careful when they leave and have the Fox News in the United States and the China Daily not exacerbate the problem by making the most of the competitive narratives that come out of diplomatic exchanges. So I think there is something here that we could think about addressing in terms of not accepting this back-to-back sort of understandable need to address the domestic population, but address the domestic population about the domestic problems, not use foreign policy, as you rightly suggest, that I think both of our countries are doing, to unify the internal politics. It's a misuse. Foreign policy should be generated in relation to what your strategic vision is of your role in the world. That's both true for the United States and for China. Not about how do we create narratives in the international arena which satisfy domestic appetites for competitive nationalism that somehow makes us feel better because we don't have an economic policy that makes us actually be better. So anyways, sorry we've taken up so much time with your first intervention, but it's very central, I think, to what the two problems are. One is that the underlying social divides and its impact on the global order. And second of all, the issue of how diplomacy is talked about by diplomats in the public square when we finish, which is a destructive, which is amplified by our media, and which drive narratives which depict each other as adversaries, when in fact what we need to do is be working together. So, thank you very much for that. But let's move on. I suggest one of the things we used to do in the OECD is you take your card and you put it up like this so we can anticipate who might be coming next. But you've had some ample time to think about it while Professor Zhu and I have taken up too much airtime. Michael Pillsbury, I'd be interested to hear from you on this. Is that right?
Sit a little further.
Michael,
Yeah, there.
Yeah, go. There's one right there. Yeah. That's too bad for him. There you go.
I have some ideas for your purpose of a vision statement or having consensus so we can report to government officials, you know, we have consensus about this, please do something. It's really one concept with three parts. There are three negotiations that have started in various ways between the U.S. and China. Think tanks should not ignore these negotiations. You can't attend the meeting, it's closed, but you can learn about it. The first, and I would call them non-negotiations. These are three things that are not happening that any vision statement has to deal with. You can't just ignore it. The first one is the trade talks. The trade talks began when Liu He came to Washington and there was a text that both sides put down their views, more than 20 demands on each side. The text grew longer and longer, finally 95 pages. There was some reneging, there were more tariffs. There's several books about this. One is excellent, a Wall Street Journal book called Superpower Showdown, the inside story of the trade talks. Henry Wang Huiyao is actually in the book for the role constructive role CCG played. Now these talks were resisted by China for 2 years. The Chinese side had some rough idea that they would have to make concessions in the trade talks. The American side punished China until the talks started. There was a mutual agreement. It was a done deal. The talks were supposed to have phase 2, things that were too hard for phase 1, mainly subsidies, where the Chinese side would have to admit how much subsidies they have to various companies, and then whether that's WTO compliant or not. Now, the Biden administration appointed a Chinese American from the House Ways and Means Committee to be their USTR. The Chinese side refuses to negotiate with her. There's no phase 2 talks at all. Phase 1 has largely not been implemented. Some things have been implemented. Trump calls it a success. Chinese side refers to it sometimes as a success. So can a vision statement or consensus ignore the Chinese side's refusal to have the trade talks continue? I put that as a question to you, Colin. Second negotiations were an idea that the Russians agreed with America. Big surprise, right? China was invited to come to the strategic stability talks, nuclear arms control discussions in Vienna. The US side put out, with the Russians' help, we put out a Russian flag, an American flag, and a Chinese flag, waiting for the Chinese delegation to come. They didn't come. Strategic stability talks has been endorsed by the Biden administration. The idea actually began under Obama, when there were some strategic stability talks. This also has to do with activities in outer space. Our side has testified that China has developed a number of offensive capabilities in outer space, one of which is one satellite reaching out to another to grab it, kind of like a James Bond movie. China can do this now. There's a number of other activities that the Russians and Americans would like to know more about. Why are you doing this? That's the strategic stability talks. China will not come. And they have various reasons. It's Cold War thinking, or our nuclear weapons are very small number. We're not a great power like you and Russia. But this is different from Xi Jinping's own speeches, where he says China's DNA and culture help China contribute to the global order. So no trade talks, no strategic stability talks. And then there's a particularly strange Chinese refusal. And I can give you the reasons. China says, no military to military contact. Now this is built up since the 70s. I myself was personally involved in the military talks. They were very helpful to both sides. that generals and admirals on each side could try to understand, like you're talking about listening today. Each side would listen to the other. Out of it came an agreement. It's a kind of like incidents at sea agreement we had with the Soviet Union, but different for China. Mutual notification of maneuvers, not going too close to each other's ships, not having Navy fighter aircraft suddenly surprise each other. Very constructive. Chinese side has stopped these talks. They refuse to restart them. It's been a Biden request now for 2 years. Chinese explanation, well, you put sanctions on our Guofang Buzhang, our defense minister, Mr. Li, and we can't, have military contact while you have these sanctions on. Okay, but is that supposed to be 100 years? Or how long are we not going to have military exchanges and contacts? This is quite important, Colin, in terms of accidental war. If you saw Joe Nye's op-ed piece in December last year, he specifically warns of an accident like the assassination that begins World War I. Many people are scared about this. We have no military channel, not for the American side, for our domestic politics, as Zhu Feng said, but because the Chinese side refuses to start the talks. We have a rumor that foreign ministry, other parts of Chinese government want these talks to start again. But PLA is in charge of the talks and they say no. Now I'm only giving you 3 examples of negotiations that are not going on. There's more examples. So the visionary statement, if you want consensus, I think cannot ignore these issues and address microeconomics or social middle class needs. That's all important. But I put it to you as a question. Isn't there a cost to any kind of consensus that leaves out at least these 3 negotiations issues that are not happening because of the Chinese side?
Sure. I'll try not to extend a comment, but I mean, on the trade side, Michael, I think it is true that for domestic political reasons involving labor, the U.S. isn't too keen on moving forward on trade talks either. It just happens the Chinese also absented themselves. So I admit that we shouldn't ignore these things. We should consider how to talk about these things, because clearly my Canadian colleague, Alan Alexandrov, who's co-chair with me of the China-West Dialogue, is a trade lawyer, and he's furious that the United States won't, but it's clear that let's just wait for November of 2024 and see how this works out. If Biden's president again, then the question is, can trade talks, will he shift? I think you can expect a number of shifts, actually. And would they shift on the trade issue and realize that at least we should try to make some progress in this area? So the strategic stability talks, I have been concerned myself about long ago. I thought it could be a G20 issue, actually. I think we do need a regulatory regime in space. We don't have any regulatory regime. And that, it seems to me, a void in global governance that we don't. It's a little bit like Bruno's problems with the technology, regulation of AI and technology. I mean, these are things where there's a void and there are problems, but the idea that we could continue in these realms without trying to have regulatory arrangements, it seems to me foolish. And so I think this is the kind of thing that in a think tank document we should mention, is to say, look, we really need to, yes, we understand there are constraints and difficulties, but the idea that we leave this to the market, leave this as a void, is really death on wheels. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think part of the issue on the military-to-military talks is that the U.S. isn't willing to give up the sanctions on the defense minister, and the Chinese aren't willing to move into it because of that, which is pretty understandable. Both sides, in a way, is understandable. But on the other hand, the idea that somehow the balloon could happen and we don't have this military-to-military contact was very revealing of a threat of possible danger. So I agree with you on all 3 points. And I think we can say some things about that. So thank you very much. I'm going to go this way. Fabian did you want to come in? He needs a microphone. Pardon me? Oh, I see. Yeah, there's some. I didn't even. Yeah, here it comes.
Thank you very much. Yes, I wanted to make 2 points really on the subject of multipolarity. And it's interesting that we've so far had a US-China conversation, so maybe I'll bring in a European perspective to make it less bipolar in the direction. So I wanted to make one comment really on how does the polarity in the world look from a different perspective from countries which are not within those two, what is often seen as the bipolar power structure. And sometimes it's hard to avoid the conclusion that it's bipolarity when you see how certain countries act. If countries force other countries to make a choice, to decide to be on one side or the other, then it becomes a very bipolar world. And I think it is important that there's a recognition that those countries which have great power also have to exercise restraint and responsibility. I think the second point really I wanted to ask is multipolarity analytical or is it aspirational or maybe a bit of both? And if it is aspirational, how do we turn this into a concept which can practically engender cooperation? How do we overcome the barriers which are there for cooperation at the moment? And there, I think what really, for me, needs to be the focus here is the question of trade-offs, the question of transition costs, the question of distributional costs. Trade-offs, transitional costs, and distributional costs. Because a lot of the changes we're going through globally will have enormous consequences. So how do we deal with those in common when they affect different countries very differently?
Okay, thank you very much. I guess the way I would answer the multipolarity, analytical versus aspirational, is to go back to pluralism and just say to you that, because I think it's not easy to grasp, is the four elements that we think hang together on this are the pluralism that exists because of cultural differentiation being as powerful a force as it is. That no country is like any other country. Every country wants to be themselves and be different. So it has a cultural foundation which is ignored by economists entirely, but which is actually the most powerful force in defining the development trajectory of countries. And so pluralism exists as a domestic phenomenon that has international spillovers. And the shifting coalitions of consensus is something that actually does happen, where people align themselves differently depending on what issue comes up. It's not widely talked about, and it's an antidote to blocks. And if you put the two together, the pluralism with the shifting coalitions of consensus, and you think about doing this in the G20, you immediately realize where there are working groups and task forces on specific issues, that combination generates complexity. You sit down at the table and all of a sudden there are a welter of interests at play, which are shifting depending on the issue. It's not just the G7 staying together in a block. People are moving depending on what issue it is. And the substance of the issues themselves is complex enough so that it generates the fourth element, which is professionalism. And professionalism is a good antidote to polemics because it doesn't easily become a binary choice between, as we just discussed. So it seems to us, and we tend to think that the G20, since we have it, does embody perfectly a place where these four elements could play out. and be nurtured by people being self-aware that this could be the dynamic that actually changes and diffuses and pluralizes the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, and it erodes the thrust towards blocks. So I'm glad to have this opportunity to sort of repeat because it took us a while to get to this point. I mean, we didn't just in one session decide that this was what it took. A half a year and half a dozen sessions, and we've talked about it a lot since. We talked about it a lot in Berlin. Is we do think that this has the potential to be, if people would buy the idea and pluralism would become as much a part of the lexicon as multipolarity is, and realize that it's behavioral, and realize that you can actually encourage people to conduct themselves in this way, encourage shifting coalitions of consensus instead of blocks, you end up with a different dynamic in settings like the G20, where we really need to, where we can and should be getting more ambition and more cooperation and more results. So that's the sales pitch. I was going to go this way, so I'm going to go to you, Mr. Ren Xiao.
Well, thank you, Chair. I'm Ren Xiao from Fudan University. I guess I have 3 points. First, I'd like to echo Colin Bradford's point, pluralism, which I think is an excellent point, because pluralism is a fundamental fact of the world in terms of political and economic systems, values, cultures, civilizations, histories, whatever. You name it. So it is a fundamental fact of the world. And therefore, it is the starting point of any talk about the world, about relations, about anything. And pluralism thus means difference, meaning that there are all kinds of differences in the world. And that leads to my second point. The question is, how do we treat, how do we handle differences? 51 years ago, when President Nixon left the White House for his historic visit to China in 1972, people gathered together at the White House, members of cabinet, members of Congress, and other people. President Nixon said to the group, saying that, well, government of the People's Republic of China and government of the United States have differences, but they do not have to be enemies. I think that spirit has to be inherited by us today. To go one step further, in my opinion, differences do not necessarily lead to conflict, but also differences could be a source of inspiration. Because things are different, one can learn from the other side and other sides, other people, about many things. So we must go one step further by pointing out that differences could be a source of inspiration for our progress and advance. However, I believe that the world would be a better place if the American policymakers accept this philosophy, that differences could be and is a source of inspiration, a source of progress for us all. I say this because it is based on my long-time observation of the United States politics, foreign policy, and philosophy. The United States has a very strong messianic sense, a sense of mission to change the world. The United States, as a national character, the country is exceptional in terms of it has a very strong motive to change the world and to make the others more like us, quote unquote, more like us meaning the United States. Now, China is different, and China is rising, and thus China is a threat. This logic is very problematic, in my opinion. Nowadays, the US policymakers use the term competition to characterize its relationship with China. And that, in my view, flows from the above-mentioned logic. But at least it is questionable. At least it is questionable. Someone is a threat simply because he is different, or that country is different, is very, very problematic, and is wrong. I think to use competition as a term to characterize the relationship between US and China is at least too simplistic, because that is only a part of the relationship. The relationship is very broad based. It has many dimensions, including people-to-people relationship. So I don't think we can just use competition to categorize the US-China relationship. So we need to rethink about it. We need to rethink about it very, very seriously. Let me end by echoing Dr. Pillsbury's comments. I think you are quite right by saying that communication, good communication, and timely communication is very, very important for our bilateral relationship. However, to blame the other side is easy. Well, I believe we in the room have legitimate reasons to blame the Chinese government and to blame the US government. We have probably many reasons to do so. That is easy, but that is not very useful. For instance, in the case of Defense Minister Li, when he was and is still sanctioned by the US government, how can we accept the proposal for the two defense, our defense minister and your defense secretary, to have a meeting. It would be very difficult for us to accept that, because that is an issue of simply an issue of dignity, right? So for me, that is very easy to understand, and I hope our American colleagues and friends can understand that too. So,
Thank you.
The issue is not blame, but to have a good dialogue on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. We're going to have to accelerate our and I'm sorry, I'm going to jump over you because you just put up your flag, and I'm going to keep going around this way because there's some people over here who had their flag up since the beginning. So I want to make sure we get there. And so please try to keep the comments more brief. Henry set a good example this morning, and I'm afraid I've been lax. We started with some very interesting comments from you, Professor Xu. So,
OK， 好，
thank you.
非常感谢哈。今天我收到这个题目以后呢，是非常宏大的题。
Thank you very much. I got this topic. I think this is a big topic, but my time is little, so I made a little preparation for it. Just now, we talked about trade negotiations. Actually, Secretary of Commerce of the United States, when visiting China, at that time, the two sides just established the ministerial and vice ministerial dialogue mechanisms, and then the finance ministries of the two countries also established a financial dialogue mechanism too. So I think these dialogue mechanisms are smooth. And just now we mentioned trade negotiations. I think we are trying to go deeper into it. So I want to share with you my personal observations about the trade negotiations. We know that the appellate system of the WTO is almost stopped, so it is in crisis. So now we are concerned about this. Can we have any rules that can be mutually or universally accepted by both China and the United States? We all recognize the market economy, but China's market economy is based on socialism. We allow different ownerships, but in the West, their market economy is based on private ownership. So for a long time, that has not ensured the smooth operation of the WTO system, because the WTO has the unprejudiced rule. That is to say, no prejudice against SOEs. So that means that that is to say the recognition of a country's ownerships should be within the scope of a country's jurisdiction. That is also reflected in CPTPP and many other agreements. In addition to WTO, they all say that, according to the EU also, their rules will not affect other countries' provisions about ownerships. So that reflects the inclusiveness of different ownerships. So we need to ensure that different economies at different stages of development with different systems can enjoy common development. But at the same time, our international trading rules need to be harmonized, whether it is based on public ownership or private ownership, whether it is SOEs or private companies should compete equally. The SOEs should not have any advantages because of its preferences from the government. So I believe the reform of the WTO should reflect the inclusiveness and harmonization. And we should honor competitive neutrality and also ownership equality. And we need to improve the subsidy rules. And we should also ensure balance and equality in terms of procedural topics. We need to ensure that the outcomes should be implemented.
But instead, for some emerging issues, we could use the methods of consultation instead of dispute settlement. For example, like the investment facilitation for development agreement that was just concluded. We had this rule for sustainable investment. This is a very good case. So the experience of China over the past 40 years of reform is that we need to give full play to both the market and government. China's success in infrastructure, solar, wind, and new energy NEVs is a very good case in point. Today we're facing with the global issues, so I think that we should, China and the West, learn from each other to find a way forward. Thank you.
To thank CCG and CWD for providing today's platform for scholars from different countries to communicate with each other. I'm so honored to participate in today's panel discussion. So my research mainly focused on public opinion, public diplomacy, and U.S. country-specific studies. I served as a visiting scholar at the Brookings Institution for 1 year back in 2008. And last year, I spent 6 months at Harvard University. Currently, I serve as the Deputy Dean of National Academy of Development and Strategy, Renmin University of China. So, based on my observation and my research, I want to share 3 viewpoints. I will be very briefly. So, firstly, I think with the dynamic trend in the strengths, the strategic competition between China and the US is likely to become the defining factor of the first half of the 21st century. Whether such competition will be rational or vicious that might harm the whole world will depend on the policy choice and political wisdom of both sides. So far, I think we still have the opportunity window to build, to find common ground, to promote cooperation and maintain stability in Sino-US relations and Sino-Western relations. Secondly, there is an urgent need for China and the US to rebuild basic trust and enhance dialogue among multiple entities, fields, and channels, to construct a framework of competitive cooperation and work together with countries around the world to address global crises and build a community with shared future for mankind. If China and the US cannot avoid confrontation or even a war, it will be a devastating disaster for the entire human civilization. So to avoid a disaster, it is really necessary for China and the US to have an accurate understanding of each other. Any underestimation or overestimation can lead to incorrect strategic judgment. So lastly, I would like to say, in China-US relations and global governance, think tanks play a really important role in idea generation, discourse, negotiation, and public opinion dissemination. The professionalism, independence, openness, and innovation of think tank enable think tank like us to transcend the difference among nation states, conduct cross-national and cross-disciplinary, even cross different field and ideological on common challenge facing human society and promote international cooperation. Today's exchange and dialogue actually are precisely playing the important role of think tanks in international relations. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. My colleague, Matt Finch.
Thanks, Colin. I was going to bore you with more discussion about my interest in and what I've been speaking about the last week about economic statecraft and questions of de-risking and decoupling. But anyone who wants to talk to me about that, we can maybe do that later. Colin's already heard me on this a few times in the last few days. But this discussion has just spurred me to maybe make a slightly different intervention on this question of pluralization. And I guess there's just a couple of thoughts that I have, and they mostly center on how we can include younger people from different parts of the world in this. I'm aware that those of us sitting around the table are not maybe the youngest folks in the room, and I think it's really important that we think about what pluralization means in terms of generations to come, especially leaders who are going to have to take on the mantle of these massive challenges that we're all talking about here. And especially at a time when we've been disconnected from one another, when there are misunderstandings based on those disconnections. Professor Zhu, you were talking about these huge changes that have happened in the U.S. How do you understand that as a researcher of American politics? It's hard enough for those of us who are from there or who work on it. And I would say the same or even is more challenging for those of us who have spent time trying to understand how things work in China domestically and in foreign relations. These are massive challenges, and for those of us who have spent time trying to teach these issues, it's a big challenge. I would just say that it's really important that we try to include younger generations, students, and not just from the United States and China or even in Europe, all of where I have taught, but also in other parts of the world where this impact of US-China rivalry is felt the most intensely: Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa. And I know there are students here from those different places, but I just think it's really important that as we talk about pluralization, that we keep this on our mind in terms of how to do good work, good research, and also come up with practical problem solving for shared challenges. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Matt. That's an excellent point. I'm going to skip here and go to the three of you on that side of the table, because I actually saw you simultaneously when I'd already started up the other side.
Well, actually, Emmanuel was the first one to raise his name card.
I couldn't see him.
You want to speak first? I can follow you. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm just going to make 3 points. I actually had a prepared speech, but I'm going to skip it because I was so inspired since this morning and also heard a lot in this session. First of all, thank you, Henry Wang, for creating this opportunity for me to speak. This is a wonderful event. This is exactly what we need to have a lot more in both China and the United States. The first point I want to make is related to this morning's session when people talk about respect, dialogue, and I think the ultimate goal is to have more mutual understanding between the two countries, as well as trying to build trust between the two countries. And I have to say, I came from Hong Kong and I taught in the United States for over 15 years. One thing that I realized in the US is that academics, I'm talking about academics, increasingly had difficult time coming to this part of the world just to engage in some regular, normal academic activities. I tried my best to invite some of my friends in the US teaching in public universities to come to Hong Kong to give academic talks, and they told me they don't want to do it, not because they find Hong Kong to be very dangerous, it's because they had to go through multiple levels of approvals in the universities and the requirements from the IT department in the university for them to bring an empty laptop to Hong Kong, okay? So I think this is not encouraging for people to exchange ideas and to learn about each other. And I'm really seeing a downward spiral, due to this kind of restrictive policies. My former colleague, Hal Brands at Johns Hopkins Science, has written a piece in 2017, published in the Bloomberg magazine, pointing a very obvious point, saying that during the Cold War era, there were a lot of students studying Russian, the language, and also the country, Soviet Union. But now in 2023, he started seeing basically all the universities shutting down departments on China, on Chinese history, on China studies. And this is not helpful for the Americans to know something more about China. And I'm pretty sure this is the same thing happening in mainland China too. And again, living in Hong Kong, I have the luxury to basically still go to the US without much restriction. So that's my first point. My second point is related to the title of this session, which is pluralism. And I think I would like to add a word that is related, and that is decentralization. When we look at all sort of global macro phenomena, call it de-dollarization, decoupling, deglobalization, whatever words that start with the word D, we tend to connect them to geopolitics right away. But in fact, technologies are also creating this kind of trends, allowing countries to outsource from multiple places, allowing companies not to produce everything in one single location. So I think, we need to think harder about, why we are living in such a world that is increasingly more fragmented, more fractured, partly because of geopolitics, but also partly because of new technologies like AI, blockchains, whatever. The third point I want to make is that due to the tension between the United States and China, there were up and rising stars, countries in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in Latin America. So those new emerging markets are exactly what we are going to see in the next 5 to 10 years. We are indeed going towards a multipolar world. And I understand, sort of the underlying meaning of Professor Nai's statement this morning. I think, we are too obsessed with looking at the two biggest powers in the world and to focus too much on the tension and ignore the global south, the rest of the world, and those are our strategic partners. No country wants to take side. You go to Southeast Asia, I would bet, besides the Philippines, most of the countries would say, I don't want to take side, don't force me to do so. And, importantly, I'm happy to see new regional economic and trade agreements like RCEP or the new BRICS that has 6 new members. And I think a lot of countries are giving up to rely on some improving relationship between the two powers, and they started to do something that is important for the economy, and they don't want to be dragged in this many years of geopolitical tension between the two powers. So these are my 3 points. I can make more, but I should let Emmanuel and others to speak. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. All good points. Emmanuel, I think justice means that you should be the next speaker. I understand the logic.
我先要强调，汉语是一个国际公。
So first, I think that if Chinese is an international language, so I think that, but I think that it will cause some problems because this is an international setting. So I'll be speaking English instead, though I can speak Chinese.
The idea of the rectification of names, that is to say, 事物跟名字应该是一致的 names and things should be in harmony together, and that this is the primary cause of problems and breakdown in governance. And I think if we look at both the American and the Chinese side, that breakdown is really at the core. And since we don't talk so much about it in many of these discussions, I'll go out on a limb and say a couple words. First, I'm going to talk about the United States, but everything I say applies to China, although in a different, with Chinese characteristics. First is government. Obviously, government is critical, but we've seen a radical tendency to privatize government, whether it's in the legislative, in which government, elected officials and staff members go work for hedge funds for several years to enrich themselves, or the outsourcing of process to for-profit organizations with their own conflicts of interest. This spills over into the military, which is also increasingly in intelligence outsourced, often to multinational corporations whose interests do not correspond with the nation state necessarily. And the word bank, I'd like to say that the term bank we used, but in fact, in many cases, it no longer corresponds with bank in the sense that we knew it 40 years ago or even 15 years ago. The nature of banks, the nature of banking, the nature of money has profoundly shifted, and the term, the concept has not kept up with these transformations. Journalism,
the passing on accurate information to the people about what's happening in the world has also been transformed by the nature of journalism and its commercialization, and this has had a terrible effect both in the United States and China and globally. And finally, I think the most serious, although it's probably not discussed that much, is the terms science and technology. I had a lot of problems, especially in China, but also in the United States. People use the term science and technology together as if they're the same thing. In fact, science is the complete opposite of technology. Science is the philosophical pursuit of truth, using a variety of methods, the scientific method being the most prominent, to ascertain what is accurate or true. Technology is a process or a system which produces a result, and often they're in conflict, as we know in this digital world, digitalized world in which we have systems of technology which often produce untrue results. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Now I'm going to ask the people on this side of the table if you could sort out among yourselves who was first. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Bradford. Thank you, President Wang. I would like to make 3 points. First, managing China-U.S. relations. I'm not sure whether we can use the term China-U.S. bipolar dynamics because we are not in a bipolar world. Nonetheless, it's of vital importance to keep a stable China-U.S. relationship. It's so important for a stable world, for world stability and prosperity. Over the past few months, we have witnessed an interesting phenomena. On the one side, the differences between the two countries are rising. On the other side, the tensions between the two countries are falling. That might become a new normal in the few months and even years ahead, because both countries are seeking the way to stabilize the relationship based on the UN Charter and the principles, namely mutual respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity, non-aggression, non-interference of the internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. No matter we have huge differences, still we can keep a stable state-to-state relationship. That will continue. That will also be beneficial or enlightful for our relations with the other Western countries. That's one point. The second point is enhance China-West relations. We know that China-U.S. relationship, no matter how important, is only a part of the China-West relations. We have a much larger perspective. Then what should we do? We know that 50% of China's trade is with Asia. Another 20% is with Europe. Only 16% of China trade is with North America. So we should have a much larger perspective. Over the past 10 years and more, plurilateral mechanism has been playing an increasingly important role in stabilizing the world situation and addressing the hot issues of the world. We should continue to do that. So we should do a good job in China-West relations. But how to do that? We should not do that in general, but should focus on some hot topics. The third point is support re-globalization. I think that might be a good topic facing China-West dialogue. Now the world is entangled with geopolitical segmentation and geo-economic fragmentation. And now geo-economic fragmentation has a beautiful name, homeland economics. It's prevailing in many countries. However, according to an IMF study, the geo-economic fragmentation, if continues, will cost world global GDP growth by 0.5% minimum to 12% at maximum. That will be bad for all of us, including China, the West, and the developing world. So it is our task and perspective and obligation to address that issue. And the world is now facing the fourth industrial revolution, the big data, artificial intelligence, and the quantum computing, new energies, new materials. The fast changing technologies may exceed all our abilities of our countries, including the developed countries. So might exceed our differences. So we should sit together to focus on the topic, how to manage under this background to have a global supply chain, to reduce or identify the differences, how to manage them, or to reduce them, how to keep the relevant, reasonable security concerns. Under these conditions, how can we work out a global supply chain with the maximum benefit for all the countries with minimum risks? If we can do that, that will be a good contribution. In this way, we should work with the industry associations and the transnational corporations and learning from their latest experiences, knowledge, and wisdom. If we can contribute in this end, that will be good for both China and the West and good for the world at large. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go immediately. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I could bring a little bit different perspective than most speakers here today. We all know politicians come and go. We all know policies change over time. But the cultural aspect, educational aspect of human society will always stay, right? Which is why 97 years ago, American educators, John Dewey and Paul Monroe, and Chinese educators, Mr. Hu Shi and Guo Bingwen, they founded this called the China Institute in America in New York City. Now, 97 years later, we are still going on with one mission from day one, which is to build the bridge between the American people and Chinese people through programs in arts and culture, in education, in business, which is why I'm the CEO of the Institute, and I have my co-chair, Pete Walker over there. We are here to participate in this discussion, and we want to make sure the exchanges between the peoples will continue to be strong, especially in today's geopolitical environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So from the very beginning of the morning, I have been listening to what our top experts have in their mind about international affairs and China-U.S. relations. I have been deeply inspired. I engaged in some economic activities between China and the United States for some time, so I want to share with you from that perspective. We have experienced the economic globalization and China's reform and opening up. I can see that most of you are in your 50s or 60s, so I think the decades that we have experienced have brought great opportunities to China and to the whole world. And now we are facing unprecedented changes and a lot of dynamics in the international situation. We have seen the COVID-19 and the increasing tensions between China and the United States. So it is very necessary for us to talk about the China-U.S. relations, especially the business ties. When we talk about business ties in the past, we often say that business ties are the baluster and stabilizer of our relations. Without the business ties, yes, indeed, it is impossible for us to be here today. I still believe that business ties are crucial. As some scholars have put it, during the Cold War era, the former Soviet Union and the United States had no economic ties or engagements, but in the past 4 decades, we have become part of each other, and we are inseparable from each other. Our trade rose from 2.5 billion at the establishment of diplomatic ties to 750 billion or 690 billion according to the caliber of the United States, an increase of several hundreds of folds. So in the past few decades, our business relations have also gone through ups and downs, and we have experienced a lot of arguments or fierce negotiations, and finally we can find our consensus for common progress. So between China and the United States, we have established more than 10 mechanisms for dialogue, and economically we have the S&ED and GSCD. And also in the early 1990s, our textile products and the market access, the joining into the WTO, etc. We held a lot of debate between each other on these topics. We had a lot of verbal fights. But finally, we can see that it turns out to be the fact that we reached agreement and we finally joined the WTO. So my point is that the U.S. exports to China, for example, mechanical products, soybean or services, or U.S. movies into China. For example, I just watched the Oppenheimer. We will never forget the McKinsey era when it hurt the scientists of the United States, and we do not want to see the bad impacts of protectionism on the benefits of the two peoples. So in one word, economic ties have brought tangible benefits to both countries. They are good for our consumers and also promoters of regional and global economies. When we talk about decoupling, actually in the past 40 years, we have already established the complete ties and bonds and connections in terms of supply chains. That is the result of our exchanges. It is not happening within one particular country, but rather it goes beyond one country into the whole region and the whole world. So if now we want to cut it off, which was taking 40 years to be established. So does that mean that we will take another 4 decades to rebuild it? So that will be lose-lose. So according to some experts, when China's trade transfers to other developing countries, that will be good for those countries indeed, but in this process of transfer, it will also be negative too. For example, infrastructure, ports, roads, water, labor skill, gas. China has a lot of advantages in all those areas. When those replaceable goods move to other developing countries, those developing countries do not have so good advantages as China. So the export price to the United States will be higher. So the U.S. consumers will have to shoulder the burden of a high cost. Of course, we can tap deeper into this topic. However, I don't think it is the right time for us to talk about decoupling. Rather, we need to talk about dialogue and negotiation and working together. Just now, some friends talk about the first phase or the second phase of a dialogue, but actually in the past, we have achieved our progress today after going through all rounds of negotiations, and now we have restored the 3 working groups between the governments, economic, financial, and commercial at the ministerial level, deputy ministerial level. So through such negotiations, we can serve to resolve the problems, and also the export control and people-to-people exchange limitations or restrictions are also bad for our contacts. I remember in the past, 5 million visitors travel between China and the United States, and every day over 100 flights were flying between China and the United States every day. But today, we can never surpass that or achieve that level. So what we need to do is to restore our normal people-to-people exchanges. And through negotiations, we need to build trust and remove the conflicts or differences of opinions. And we need to expand further our market in terms of rules, development, management and standard development, we also need to further open our market. We have over 20 pilot free trade zones, and in our pilot free trade zones, we can do a lot of experiments.
At the same time, China and the US should make the cake bigger because our total economy accounts for more than 40% of the world economy. So, as someone said this morning, our interests should outweigh the conflicts in energy and food and climate. We have a lot of comparative advantage that we could leverage. For example, I said a few days ago in petrochemicals and in energy, China has a lot of advantage. In terms of agriculture, elderly care, climate change, there's many opportunities for us to tap. So we should focus on tapping these potentials to make greater contributions to the region and to humanity.
Vigorous and ambitious speech about how we may be able to do more in trade in the future than we've been able to do so far. So I'm afraid we're not only out of time, we're over time. And so what I want to say, I'm sorry, I'm going to come and talk with you in a minute. I'm sorry to miss the two of you there on that side. Yes. Yeah. I think we just need to stop, right?
We can extend a few minutes. Maybe we can finish. We
Okay.
extend.
We extend it. Okay. Henry's the boss here, so.
No. Let's extend 10 minutes, and then we.
Yeah.
3 minutes each.
Yeah. Keep it short. Henry set a good example this morning, and I'm afraid my chairmanship of this hasn't been quite as effective as his. So. Yeah.
非常感谢。
Thank you. For giving me this chance. So in the interest of time, I just want to say that maybe China-US relations are in a situation of mutual winning, or win-win, because in the digital era, the landscape has shifted. The opportunities for reaching an equilibrium has passed. For example, if we provide an operating system, suppose we provide the operating system, it can't be that all countries in the world are providing operating systems. So this is a new phenomenon of win-win through cooperation. We know that relations between states are largely founded on those between enterprises. For example, in 1984, the first Kentucky opened, and then in 1990, and the McDonald's opened. The KFC, Kentucky Fried Chickens, they did a lot of research, but McDonald's just opened a store opposite KFC. They brought fast food, American-style fast food, into China. The same thing happened between Chinese companies, Mengniu and Yili, Hisense and Haier. So, in general, digital economy or corporate competitions have brought significant taught us a lesson that we could expand the market through competition, increase the benefits for all people. So I think that this is also the EU and China are now developing third-party markets. So this, in the interest of time, this is all I have to share. Thank you. Thank you for this chance. There is a news that we failed to mention this day. It's the governor of California has already has arrived in Hong Kong and will soon visit Beijing and Shanghai. So if we look at the editorial by Global Times yesterday, if we look at the statement by the Californian government, we may have this impression that the US and China are very friendly countries in the world. So we need to consider that there are very good momentums of cooperation on regional levels in two countries. We have the Silicon Valley, Central Valley. Central Valley is home to over half of production of fruits and nuts in the US. So if we can take into consideration more of these positive elements between us, I think that the future, I wouldn't say will be brilliant, but at least it won't be dissatisfactory. Mr. Pillsbury, when trade negotiations were falling apart in 2019, he came to China and we had a discussion together. I think that our views were able to reach our respective political leaders, leading to the phase one negotiation results between China and US. But after the signing of the agreement, shortly afterwards, COVID-19 broke out and became a global pandemic. We saw US politics became chaotic, and we haven't still seen a correction in this chaotic trend in politics in the US. This visit by the governor of California, I think that it is more representative of the future of our bilateral relations. Under Trump's administration, when things were tough, we were able to reach an agreement. So in today's environment, I think it's all the more possible that we can reach a better agreement. Thank you.
I also want to make 3 points. First, I think stability is not something optional to the international community. It's the foundation of international society. Because I think Secretary Blinken argued a few weeks ago that geopolitical instability is a feature of current international order. I think the US strategy, competition strategy, include toleration, even taking advantage of instability situation. For example, in the recent Biden administration's policy towards the Middle Eastern conflict, the U.S. even taking advantage of the Middle Eastern conflict to promote more budget, not only for Middle East and the European situation, but also for programs such as AUKUS. I think we need to realize that if we want to promote stability, we should constrain allies, and we should promote more cooperations among the great powers. So I think the major responsibility of all the great powers include reducing and constraining instability and promoting stability. We have to facilitate a transition from instability to stability. And the second thing I want to mention is the revival of multilateralism in crisis management and the conflict management. Because right now we are facing major crises in the Middle East, in Europe, in the Asia Pacific as well. I don't think that any single great power or any single bloc can dominate in the management of this crisis and conflict. So we need a division of labor, and we need some trust among great powers to do crisis management and conflict management. The third point I want to mention is the so-called the AI arms control. I think that some people recently write some articles argue that we need to learn the lessons of the nuclear arms control during Cold War for the arms control of AI today. I think there are some differences between AI and the nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons is primarily nuclear weapons. I think AI is a technology can be applied to civilian life and the military as well. So I think the U.S. approach to AI related to China is a little bit confusing, because if you want to suppress the AI infrastructure and AI research and development in China, it's quite difficult for any serious negotiations with China on so-called military risk of AI. So I think we need a two-track approach to AI arms control. Track one, cooperation and exchanges on the application of AI to the welfare of every people. And secondly, serious discussions about uncertainties and risk of AI to both civilian life and military application. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bruno, I think we're going to ask you to maybe speak in the next session. Are you going to be here for that? Yeah, maybe you could, are you going to be around for the next session? I think what we need to do, and I'm sorry to not manage the time better, is we need to take a 15-minute coffee break, come back here at 3:30, because we have to end at 4:30. We'll give it an hour instead of an hour and a half, which was given to this session. So I just want to thank everyone for being as expressive as you have been about issues that are on your mind that would fit into a process that this is part of, to formulate some concepts and proposals and concrete ideas that might be useful in the public square, and hopefully the process itself will generate some of the relationships, professional relationships that we think is part of promoting mutual understanding and respect as well. So let's just take a 15-minute coffee break, come back at 3:30. Henry, does that seem right? Yeah? And then we'll proceed to talk about international norms and global engagement platforms in the second round. Thank you very much to each and all of you, and apologies especially to you and Bruno for not being able to